So we've been talking a lot about how North Korea on Monday restored those direct communication lines with South Korea. It's coming 8 weeks or so after the regime severed the hotline between the two sides. Now, this gesture coming despite the North's launching in recent weeks of not just one, but a series of rather advanced missiles.
For more on the significance of the line being restored, the general state of inter-Korean relations and North Korea-U.S. ties, we're joined on Skype by Professor Ramon Pacheco Pardo, Professor of International Relations at King's College London and the author of the book North Korea-U.S. Relations from Kim Jong Il to Kim Jong Un. Professor, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Professor, the inter-Korean communication line was down for more than 50 days. How much significance do you put on it being restored, and why do you think North Korea is reopening it at this particular point in time?
Well, I think it is significant because this goes back to the policy that North Korea seemed to be following before the joint military drills. In my view, North Korea had to protest against the drills. It has been a long-term policy of the North Korean regime. And now that the drills are in the past and North Korea has tested new technologies itself, new missile technologies, we're back to where we were back in July, in June and early July. So I think that now we will see the restoration of dialogue between the two Koreas for a period of weeks and months, because North Korea wants to see what it can get out of this dialogue with South Korea.
Now, as you would expect, Professor, South Korea welcomed the North's decision to do this, but what reasonably can Seoul expect? President Moon would like some kind of end-of-war declaration and another inter-Korean summit before he leaves office. Do you actually foresee the reopening of this line naturally evolving to something much more meaningful?
Well, I think that President Moon's policy has been very clear to lay the foundations for a stable engagement process and hopefully peace process between the two Koreas. And he's going to try to do this until he leaves office. Whether there is a summit or not, I think will depend on whether President Moon can obtain significant material concessions from the North Korean regime that he can present to the South Korean people as a substantial development in inter-Korean relations. A peace declaration, I think, will be very important because it is quite symbolic. It would be quite symbolic if it comes to happen. So it could be the concession that President Moon is looking for, and that he could present to the next South Korean president, who will be elected in March, as a starting point for future inter-Korean relations.
Now, Professor, let's shift to the North Korea-U.S. relations. Now, despite the regime's numerous weapons demonstrations, Washington hasn't strongly criticized them. But still, it seems like the North is refusing any kind of interaction with the Biden administration. How do you see Pyongyang-Washington ties unfolding over the next 3 years?
Well, I think what's happening with the Biden administration as opposed to the Trump administration is that U.S.-North Korea relations have to advance in parallel with inter-Korean relations. So regardless of whether North Korea wants it or not, if inter-Korean relations are to move forward, North Korea will have to sit down with the U.S. to negotiate the concerns that the Biden administration and the U.S. government has about North Korea's nuclear weapons, long-range missiles, potentially human rights as well. So I think that North Korea will be forced at some point to negotiate with the Biden administration, whether it likes it or not. And once it does this, we'll have a more normal diplomatic process, starting with working level talks, as opposed to what we had during the Trump administration, which was the high-level or top-level summits between Washington and Pyongyang, but that had very little substance. I think the Biden administration will pursue a very different policy from the Trump administration, and ultimately North Korea will probably be forced to agree to it.
Yeah, the Trump administration very much was a more top-down approach to North Korea diplomacy. But finally, I wanted to get your thoughts regarding North Korea's various missiles it's been firing. They are more technologically advanced than the ones we've seen fired by the North in the past. Should the international community be worried about them? And perhaps more importantly, from where all of a sudden did the North find these new rocket-building skills?
I think the second question is very interesting, right? We have to assume that there has been support coming from China, potentially from Russia as well, and of course indigenous developments. North Korea has shown that it has the ability and the technological capabilities necessary to continue to progress in its missile and nuclear programs, together with the outside support that I mentioned. I do think, though, that as long as North Korea only conducts short-range and maybe mid-range missile tests, we're going to see limited concern from the international community. Yes, there will be condemnation, as there should be, because they go, in many cases, against the UN Security Council resolutions. But clearly, the US right now only cares about ICBMs and nuclear tests. And even if you look at South Korea, and if you look at other North Korean neighbors, there are denunciations of these tests. But really, unless we see a major provocation, it seems that the international community, and this includes South Korea, this includes the US, is going to be willing to talk to North Korea. And I think that Pyongyang is aware of this.
Yeah, I think there's a vast difference between short-range missile launches and ICBM tests. But we thank you very much for your insights. If you are joining us from London, we appreciate you staying up so late for us, and we look forward to speaking to you again in the future.
That was Professor Ramon Pacheco Pardo, Professor of International Relations at King's College London, on the restoration of the hotline and the current state of play with North Korea.